Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really excited to be here today to present on part of my PhD work on the Christmas Island flying fox. And thank you again to Bat Conservation Trust for having me here, and without the help of the Kate Barlow Award, I wouldn't have been able to come here today. So for those of you who are not familiar with Christmas Island, it is an external Australian territory, approximately 2,600 kilometers off the coast of Western Australia. Its closest landmass is actually Indonesia, just to the north, about 300 kilometers. It's most well known for its red crab migration, which you guys might have seen on Animal Planet or David Attenborough. But it also has a large biodiversity of tropical bird species as well as marine life. Now, Christmas Island once had 5 endemic mammals, but over the last century, 4 of these have actually gone extinct, including the Christmas Island shrew, the McClear's rat, the bulldog rat, and the most recent extinction occurring in 2009 of the Christmas Island pipistrelle, which leaves the Christmas Island flying fox the last endemic mammal on Christmas Island. So the Christmas Island flying fox is a medium-sized flying fox. It weighs approximately 300 to 400 grams. And it was once estimated to have a population of about 6,000 individuals in the 1980s, but is now thought to have approximately 2,500 individuals remaining. And as a keystone species and an important seed disperser and pollinator, the decline of this species could be very detrimental to the Christmas Island ecosystem. While there have been a number of theories that have been suggested for its decline, these are not well understood, and they include a range of different things, including non-detection, decline in food resources, disease and parasites, disturbance by yellow crazy ant, which is an invasive species, habitat loss, as well as predation by invasive cats and snakes. Now, my PhD specifically focuses on these 3 health-related threats, including decline in food resources and improper diet, which is something I'm going to be focusing on today, as well as disease and parasites and heavy metal intoxication. So as I said, I don't have enough time to go through all of these, but today I'll be focusing on introduced plants and some of the thoughts we have in regards to how this could be impacting this flying fox species. So just to give you a bit of history on the land use on Christmas Island, so since its settlement in the late 1800s, clearing across the island has expanded dramatically, as you can see here. And this is mostly due to a little bit of human settlement, but also the introduction of a large phosphate mine on the island that started in the early 1900s. And this phosphate mine is actually the 2nd largest phosphate mine in Australia, and it is now thought that approximately 30% of the island has been cleared for this purpose. Now, once the mining has completed, this mining lease land is actually turned over to the national park, and it's rehabilitated back into native rainforest. But historically, as well as sometimes today, there has also been a large introduction of non-native plant species, some of which you can see here, like Japanese cherry, breadfruit, bananas, and mango. And we see that the Christmas Island flying foxes forage on a number of these species as well as native species. And now it is actually found that non-native species actually outnumber the number of native species across the island. Now, this is particularly of concern because if the Christmas Island flying fox is preferentially foraging on these different non-native species, there have been limited studies to suggest that non-native species actually have less protein, energy, and carbohydrates, as well as essential minerals such as calcium and sodium for reproduction and fecundity, in comparison to native species, and thus could be leading to nutritional imbalances in the population. So this brings me to my main objective of this part of my project, which is, could preferential foraging on introduced plants result in nutritional imbalances in the Christmas Island flying fox? And within this, I have 2 main aims. One is, how did Christmas Island flying foxes historically use native plant species to meet their nutritional requirements? And 2, does nutritional content of non-native food plants actually differ from those of native food plants? So to study this, I was on Christmas Island from for different periods of time from May 2018 until March of this year, collecting various food plants that we see the Christmas Island flying foxes foraging on. So this included a number of flower species which they forage on the nectar, and so I collected both non-native as well as native flower species and collected the nectar for sugar content analysis, which we then would look at on a handheld refractometer, as you can see here, so that we can measure sucrose levels for energy. I also collected a number of fruit species, so here's a papaya up here, and this is Japanese cherry, which is a commonly eaten non-native plant species. And so in total I was able to collect about 137 plant samples, which included 17 species of non-native fruit, 8 species of native fruit, as well as 5 leaves, stems, and petioles that the Christmas Island flying fox forages on. So as far as the other food plants other than the flowers, what I would have to do is collect these, I'd cut them up, desiccate them in an oven, and then mill them and store them on silica to be transported to a commercial laboratory for nutritional analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about those results now. So as you can see here, the introduced plants are in red, seen here, here, and here, and the native plants are in blue. And on average, we found that introduced plants had significantly higher amounts of moisture and carbohydrates, but significantly lower amounts of crude protein in comparison to native species. And when also looking at some micronutrients, I know that this is a busy slide, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that introduced plants also had significantly lower amounts of calcium, magnesium, sodium, copper, zinc, manganese, and iron in comparison to native plants. And I'll talk about the implications of this in a little bit. As I had also mentioned, the Christmas Island flying fox also forages on a number of native leaf species, so we also wanted to know, because the micronutrients in particular are quite low in our fruit species, whether or not they could actually be getting that from native leaves. So I just want to draw your attention to this bottom line here. And as you can see, it is the case that native leaves actually had significantly higher percentages of crude protein, calcium, magnesium, sodium, copper, iron, manganese, and zinc, but significantly lower levels of carbohydrates. One other thing I want to draw your attention to is that, in general, all of the plants that we looked at actually had very low phosphorus levels. This is usually what's considered a minimum requirement for a flying fox population. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. Now, in assessing our sucrose sugar readings, while we didn't see a difference between native flowers, as highlighted in red here, and introduced flower sucrose readings in this study, in looking through previous literature of other flower species that have been studied in the past, we see that in general, non-native flower species actually have higher percentages of sucrose levels, as you can see here, in comparison to native species, which suggests that actually non-native flower species might be a good source of energy for these flying foxes. So kind of tying this all back into my original questions, the first being, how does the Christmas Island flying fox historically use native plants to meet nutritional requirements? So in looking at those native plant species, we found a couple of different things. So the first thing being that the majority of energy intake seems to come from protein as well as carbohydrates, mostly from fruit and nectar. But as we saw, protein was actually quite low in both fruit and almost negligent in nectar when you look in the literature, as well as macronutrients, which are important, as I had mentioned, such as calcium and sodium. Therefore, the Christmas Island flying fox is likely supplementing its diet with leaves, stems, petioles, as well as pollen to account for those obtaining the adequate protein level as well as essential minerals. So as we would all expect, this means that a diversity of plants is truly required to meet the nutritional requirements for this species and likely for other flying foxes as well. So bringing me to my next question was whether or not non-native food sources actually did have a difference in nutritional quality in comparison to native food species. So in short, the answer is yes. So we saw that introduced plants on average had lower crude protein, but higher amounts of carbohydrates than native species. Now this is of concern because if the Christmas Island flying fox is actually preferentially feeding on non-native plant species, they could be taking in more to obtain the adequate amounts of crude protein, but then they would also be taking in excess carbohydrates, which could actually lead to obesity in the population. Additionally, we also found that introduced fruits had significantly lower levels of essential minerals in comparison to native fruits. But as I had mentioned before, leaves generally accounted for a lot more essential minerals in comparison to fruit, and that's likely why they're supplementing their diet with leaves. Lastly, as I had mentioned, fruit and leaves, or I guess all the plant species we assessed, had much lower levels of phosphorus than we were expecting, so it might actually be a limiting nutrient in this population. And this is particularly important during lactation and parturition because it's been found that flying fox milk has approximately 0.6 to 0.8% of phosphorus. So if this is limiting and the flying foxes aren't getting enough phosphorus, that could actually lead to bone demineralization as well as bone deformity in the population. So this is something that we're watching out for and want to learn a little bit more about. But one other question we wanted to know is whether or not all introduced plants are created equally. And what we found is that no, this is not the case. So we found that Japanese cherry, which is actually a very common rehabilitated plant that's planted across a bunch of rehab fields, as well as breadfruit, seem to have very similar nutritional profiles as that of native fruit, suggesting that there are some introduced plant species that have similar nutritional profiles that are actually very useful for the Christmas Island flying fox. So in conclusion, a diverse landscape is key to sustain this population. Introduced plants could cause nutritional imbalances, but not all plants are created equally. And in giving back to Christmas Island National Park staff, we've suggested that it's important to choose plants with nutritional profiles similar to that of native plants. To choose non-native plants that have similar nutritional profiles to that of native plants or native plants in their revegetation schemes. So with that, I'd like to thank my supervisors, Dr. David Phelan, Carrie Rose, Justin Welbergen, and Ellen Dierenfeld, as well as my field team, Annabelle Dorstein, Lauren Bissett, Ari Jermoyne, and Sophie Hall, and Christmas Island National Park staff who helped me with on-the-ground knowledge as well as identification of all the plant species. A special thank you again to Bat Conservation Trust and the Kate Barlow Award, as well as Taronga Conservation Society and the Australasian Bat Society who helped provide funding for parts of my PhD. With that, I'll take any questions.